In 1997, Holly Moyes, an archaeologist at the University of California, led an expedition to survey a large cave system in Belize known as Acton Tunichil Munal. As they followed a bizarre complex of chambers 3 miles into the earth, they discovered thousands of offerings to ancient gods, including the skeletal remains of thousands of human sacrifices, and tools and ceramics made from the semi-precious stone obsidian. What made this find even more unusual was that as Holly and her team followed the trail deeper and deeper into the cave, it appeared to have no end. Where would it ultimately lead to? Descriptions of the caves in the Popolva, an ancient Maya creation myth, has led many to believe these archaeologists had uncovered an opening to the ancient underworld known as Xibalba, a much-feared threshold to the afterlife.
The Maya have an interesting and related legend about an underworld called Xibalba. And Xibalba is basically their version of hell. And these lords of the underworld in the Mayan story cycle are basically reptilian-headed humanoids. You have one guy who's got a crocodile head, another who's got an iguana head. Chak the Rain God has a bird head, which is somewhat reptilian. And this is a theme again that we find again throughout underworld lore. Stories about beings that rule these nether regions are often reptilian yet humanoid.
Reptilian yet humanoid is not a new myth in the ancient worlds. But are these Mayan myths of an underground simply folklore? Or could there be some scientific evidence that habitable places below the earth could exist?
The hollow earth theory has been around for several years, and this is something that has now begun to fascinate people again. The original theory goes back maybe 500 years, and various very well-known historical figures have talked about this. Sir Isaac Newton was the proponent for the hollow earth. The earth is not solid by a long shot. The earth is, there's always a lot of movement and motion going on down deep inside the earth. So the idea that there could be large spaces inside the crust of the earth, even down as far as the crust mantle boundary, that might be conducive to habitation is not that impossible.
There's a lot of scientists today, planetary scientists, credible planetary scientists, that will tell you that when a planet evolves, when it comes into being, it has to do so in such a way that the center is hollow. And in fact, they dropped a bomb on the moon not too long ago. And the NASA geologist, wanted to record the vibrations coming out of it so they could tell something about the inner structure. And it rang for 8 hours like a bell, like an empty bell. And that kind of gives you a glimpse. Now, whether or not the Earth itself is completely hollowed out inside, or whether or not they are just vast inner caverns that might be the size of whole continents, I'm not sure. But what I can tell you is that in ancient civilization, all over the globe, they have these hollow earth stories.
In my research, I have discovered maps that show a lot of these deep underground bases, or also known as DUMBs. These bases are in locations where there appear to have been other openings deep under the earth. And how do I know this? Well, anybody can figure it out because we have access to the ground penetrating radar data. This data shows specific types of caverns and openings deep, deep beneath the earth, sometimes a mile deep. And what it appears when you look at some of these overlaying military tunnels, it seems as if they knew where they were at, so they actually tunneled to these actual locations, these ancient locations, and kind of made them into their path as they created their own grid.
When we look at the creation stories of our past, as different as they are from one another, there are common themes that weave them all together. One of the most obvious of these common threads is the theme of another world beneath this one, a world, subterranean world, from which our ancestors emerged. The Mayan calendar, for example, is a circular calendar, and it shows 4 boxes with unique glyphs representing the 4 worlds of the past. And the Maya say there have been 4 previous worlds. We live in the 5th world. It is represented by the circle and the image that is staring right at us from that circle. Each of those 4 previous worlds was destroyed. One was destroyed by wind, one was destroyed by fire, one was destroyed by ice. And when the ice melted, a great flood destroyed the 4th world. And that flood story is one of the common themes that we find throughout these indigenous traditions. So the question is that just mythology? Or are there any physical links that can help us relate to these in the real world?
Maybe the links in the physical world are to our genetic existence and how humans were able to survive cataclysm after cataclysm.
All species tend to transcend into something else sooner or later. This is the process of evolution and natural selection, which some people find very annoying. But I see no mileage in saying evolution doesn't happen. You need species to have the ability to bounce back from assaults. For example, if you have a giant asteroid or comet hit the Earth and make life on Earth extremely fragile and tenuous, you need to be able to bounce back from that. In other words, you need to be able to duck and dive and evolve to adapt to the new situations and keep the project of life going. The whole process of evolution is a process of unfolding. Could we become very different from what we are now? Yes, given enough time, given enough new situations to adapt to and develop with.
Could these new situations have included taking refuge within the inner earth?
We have the biblical texts about this notion of giants in the old days, and certainly after the great floods and the great cataclysmic events that may have sunk Atlantis, we can only speculate to say that there could be a breakaway civilization that went underground at the end of the last cataclysm. And these beings, some of whom could be giants, others could look just like us or some similar human to us, could be living inside the earth.
You get the Mayans who kind of disappeared. Like there's speculation they may have ascended, they may have gone to a deeper plane existence that we originally came out of. And same with the Tuatha De Danann in Ireland. Like they're said to be gods or fairies or ancestral spirits, but they were originally people. I also see like a lot of legends where people coming out of the sea and coming out of the earth may tie into the Atlantis myth where we've come from deeper planes of ontology. Because a lot of time the underworld does represent a deeper plane of existence.
Anton Park's research indicates that the underworld can also be linked to creation.
In ancient texts, in Gnostic, Sumerian, even Egyptian texts, the abyss is always linked to the process of creation. So we find this recurrent theme of the abyss. And through the research that I have done, I found out that Enki is the master of the abyss, of the great deep, which also, in some ways, corresponds to the underworld.
If you go back to the Mesopotamian creation stories, they talked about gods from the sky basically bioengineering a form of humanity that was already here, creating that more modern form. But they don't necessarily say that the engineering was done in the sky. For example, Enki was also the god of the underwater realms. So there was a possibility that maybe there was some realm underwater or underground where some of this activity was being conducted. And so you have this possibility, at least within the lore, you don't necessarily exclude skyborn gods from gods that lived underground because people had both ideas, that the gods had realms underground, underwater, and in the sky, and they interacted with all of them.
Indeed, the further back you go in history, the more you are faced with giants, just like prehistoric animals on Earth. For example, the dinosaurs. Roughly, I would say that if Enki is about 6 feet 5 inches, closer to human, On and the other Sumerian gods and goddesses by the way they were portrayed, I would say are about 11 feet 5 inches, between 10 feet and 11 feet 5 inches, maybe even up to 14 feet.
If some of the Sumerian gods were suggested to be giant in size, how would this relate to myths of an underworld in South America? Sonia Grace uses her alternative research to connect the dots on the underground mythology in Mesopotamia.
When I first spirit traveled to the Ziggurat of Ur, I was really amazed because there was a very small structure, like a temple, made out of stone. And the ant people, who I call the Savroks, were all over the land. They were everywhere. And one of them came up to me, and these are ginormous ants. These are not, little ants or people that look like, they're ants. And they came up to me and they said, "We created this place in the beginning, and this is what we built for the people of Atlantis, so that when Atlantis fell, they had a place to go to. We helped them to safety." And they said, "We want to take you and show you this place." So we went through this little opening and we started going down and further into this long tunnel. It went on forever. And then all of a sudden it opened out into this beautiful, huge cavern. There were all kinds of rocks and crystals and stones in the walls. There was a lake, and it went on into further caverns. It was enormous. And they said, "This is where we led the people who did survive and got out of Atlantis before it fell." And at the top of the cave were these roots from a big tree that was coming down. And they said that when the people were there, they referred to this place as Eden. It was the place that they had that was their refuge, that saved them. So they referred to it and called it Eden. And when the world came back and life was happening on the surface again, in the roots of the tree that were coming down from the top of the cave, they could see greenery coming out and growing, so they knew it was okay to come back up to the surface. And when they came back up, they referred to this tree as the tree of life.
If the underworld is not only a place of creation, might it also have been a place to hide? In the Hebrew Bible, the Nephilim were the sons of gods mingling with the daughters of Adam. They were also known as giants and considered to be the fallen ones. Michael Mott's research suggests that they might have retreated underground. Are these the giants described in ancient texts?
Some people will say that these giants are pre-Adamites, which means they came about before Adam and Eve. Some say that they are Nephilim, which would mean they are part human and part fallen angel. And this is a theme that does find a reflection in some of the Native American lore, because the giants are described as having 6 fingers, 6 toes, double rows of teeth. Occasionally they have horns. And this ties right in with the ancient description of the Nephilim, for instance, from the Book of Enoch and other sources, and even from the Old Testament. So this is something that we see again and again. They fled a cataclysm. They fled something they fear. So they go beneath the earth, and they claim that they live much longer by living there. There's plenty of water. There are strange areas where there seems to be a lot of high pressure, which blow out a lot of breathable air. And that's not to say that you wouldn't have to have a really advanced level of not just civilization, but technology in order to carve out a space inside the crust of the planet and to make a sustainable environment there.
What became of the gods? I'm not sure that I can give an answer to this question. Maybe that the survivors, the ones that could still be alive in our solar system, live underground on Earth.
There are many reports that these giants moved inside the Earth, into the inner Earth. According to my information, it is a honeycomb of caverns inside the Earth, and there are many groups living inside. Groups that are non-terrestrial, groups that left the surface of the Earth many, many millennia ago and just never came back out.
Has any evidence been discovered that can prove the existence of a lost underground civilization? Historians have been debating this for centuries. Perhaps the answer to this question lies deep in the Amazon jungle, 2,500 miles south of Belize. An indigenous tribe known as the Makushi have lived here with little contact from the outside world until the mid-18th century, and yet their mythology is almost identical to beings who protect the hollow earth described by the Mayans.
You have that South American tradition, which is very interesting, of the tribe that said that they were guarding the entrance to the inner earth. And they said it would take maybe a couple of weeks to finally get down far enough where they would meet the inhabitants, and they were just these gigantic people, anywhere between 10 and 11.5 feet tall. So, of course, the common idea is that, oh, this is just a bunch of mythology by a primitive people. But what's interesting is they talked about how when they got far enough down, one of the things they saw was basically molten rock. And that's exactly what modern science tells us you should find underneath the earth. And how would a primitive people know that? There are also areas where there's all this lush plants and food and the people living down there. Can we take that seriously? We're left with this very interesting myth that has a few intriguing elements to it. It's worth a look if we can get down there.
The Mahaxi Indians of Guyana and also of the northern Amazon basin have a very interesting legend concerning an entrance to the inner earth. And according to their legend, there is an entrance to the underworld there. And at one point, they were in charge of security over the entrance to this location. And according to their legend, they could descend into this world and come into contact with the very tall men who were basically giants, 15 feet tall, 12 feet tall. And they had been given this task of guarding this location and the entrance and not letting anyone else enter.
Traveling for 15 days down into this cavern until they literally put down their torches, because there's these inner balls of light that will light you the rest of the way on steps that are 33 inches long. Eventually making it into caverns where food was growing, lit by 4 large sun-like discs that they couldn't even stare at, they were so bright. And they describe the food as being apples the size of a human head, grapes the size of a human fist, interacting with giant beings that they described as being 3 to 4 meters in height, who would catch giant fish for them and give it to them as a gift. That kind of detail coming from a culture who didn't have any access to libraries, didn't have any access to television, satellite, internet. How is it that they come across or begin to tell stories that are being duplicated in all these other cultures? There has to be some truth to it. Now, whether it's completely hollow inside or whether or not these vast caverns are just there, I believe that they're there. And a lot of people believe that they're inhabited by what we would describe as being an alien species, an ultra-terrestrial species rather than an extraterrestrial species.
Could these strange species be linked to the Sumerian gods? Many of these stories about a lost civilization under the earth from indigenous cultures around the world have strong similarities. Is it possible that these giant creatures were the sages described in ancient Sumerian texts and others? And did these beings bring back humanity after a cataclysm?
In Sumerian tradition and in the surviving texts that have been passed down to us, there is a very strong and intriguing reference to what are called the 7 antediluvian sages. Go over to India, and we have the 7 rishis. So this number keeps on cropping up. We can go further away to Easter Island, and there we discover an ancient tradition that civilization was first brought to Easter Island by 7 initiated men. Now, how are we to take all of this, and how can we put it into some kind of context? For me, what I think we're looking at is more evidence that there was a high civilization that we have lost track of, that we truly are a species with amnesia, and that we have forgotten a very important part of our story. And fragments of that story crop up all around the world. What I think we're looking at is an outreach program an outreach program reaching out to the hunter-gatherers in what we would call the Upper Paleolithic, and beginning to teach certain of them selected skills, giving them the gifts of civilization. But to find this theme again and again and again, the 7 sages, the 7 wise men, teaching the gifts of civilization, I would say we are looking at symbolic allusions towards the outreach of a lost civilization.
But who are these beings we have lost touch with?
If we look back throughout all the historical cycles, we find this interaction with supposed reptilian humanoids. That goes as far as even the mythic cycles of Europe, and the whole concept of, like, for instance, frog princesses and all these other strange things that we find coming down to us in lore about these people who aren't quite human, or they can pass as human sometimes, but they have a reptilian aspect. The stories about them and their interactions with people. It's often seen that, like, for instance, in the Mayan underworld, that even though these brothers kill some of these beings, the Mayan royalty traces their lineage to some of these same beings. And this is a theme we'll see, around the world, whether it's China, Japan, wherever it is. You have an elite group that believes that they are descended from these mostly unseen beings who live under the earth. The Anunnaki in the Sumerian text are described as being reptilian to some extent, or have bird-like heads, reptile-like heads. Even in contemporary accounts in ufology, people talk about the reptoids and these humanoid beings with reptilian heads. And this theme, again, is associated with the underworld and with these unseen manipulators of the human race. In the legends of Central Asia, there are stories about subterranean civilizations. One of these is called Agartha or Agarthi. The other one is called Patala. And Patala is often associated with the Naga, who are reptilian humanoids.
As described in the Mahabharata, the Nagas are considered to be a subterranean, half-human, half-serpent race. At some point in the ancient text, they are important players in many of the events in the epic, and frequently even on the side of good, given the nature of their character. They dwell in the city Patala, which is said in the Vishnu Purana to have 7 realms, which are located one above the other. Patala is a paradise, and the Naga that live there are described as a very advanced race or species with a highly developed technology. According to the legend, they wage war on the kingdom of Agartha.
The Agarthans are supposedly enlightened human beings, and they have a ruler over them called the King of the World. He has a capital called Shambhala, which is in Agartha. And from this area, supposedly, he influences events on the surface world. They also influence human civilization. They either interfere with our civilization to slow it down, or they give us little things to help advance it when it suits their purposes. We get the idea, we get the story that there's more than one group, and that they have various agenda that conflict with each other.
Are these underground beings really manipulating us? And if so, how? Graham Sear believes the underworld is a world that reaches out to us when we least expect it.
The entrances to the inner earth describe portals into the underworld, and the underworld is actually a plane between spirit and nature. It's the area of reality where spirit becomes nature and nature turns back into spirit. So it's an intermediary, sort of paradoxical, apparitional realm, which is closer to spirit than nature is, because it's where nature comes out of. It's where the spirits initially start to embody before they finally densify and kind of fall into this frequency range. You can look at it as the Christian purgatory, or the Celtic otherworld, or the Egyptian Duat, or the Kabbalistic Yetzirah. These are all different names that refer to this intermediary plane. That's also where prophetic imagination occurs, and all these things. It's where revelation occurs.
We are drawn to caves. Joseph Campbell said that all of the world's religions probably started in some cave in Siberia, where the first shamans went and had a dream or a vision, told a story, and the story was retold and retold. Interesting that it might have been in a cave. Well, the shamans in Siberia lived in caves, but caves reach down and down. Spelunkers go and explore the depths of unseen parts of the planet. This planet, the planet we have known and studied so well, there are all these unseen places. There is more to be known. Even as our technology advances, we have to be humbled by how much close at hand we do not know. The ancients, the people, the primal people that lived close to the earth saw the gods and spirits, the sacred energies as down in those places. Whether we go down to explore physically, personally, I'll let somebody else do the exploring. But I want to explore mentally and spiritually. I want to imagine what is below us, what the earth has to teach us. It is a living thing, and our lives are tied to it. So we don't have to be adherents of the ancient nature religions to know this is important stuff. But the stories can help us that perhaps there is some kind of personality that we're in a relationship with, some god, some goddess more likely, since the earth is maternal, it feeds us, that we need to be respectful of and to seek a deeper relationship with.
Could there really be beings living inside of the earth, manipulating humans? Is it possible we at one time were created or recreated beneath the surface? Or is the meaning behind the legends a metaphor for the greatest secrets the earth keeps on our human existence? Does this mean we're all searching for our own personal Xibalba? Andrew Collins suggests something from beyond this planet might be trying to get in touch with us on the surface. He points to a discovery by astronomers at the Green Bank Telescope that suggested light signals were emanating from a star in the Cygnus constellation 1,200 light-years away. This fluctuating star was catalogued KIC 8462852 and named Tabby's Star.
Now, what I have determined relating to this star is that there are certain cycles associated with the Kepler data. They are all interlinked and they all reflect certain key numbers. And those key numbers are the numbers 11, 121 and 1331. Now, all of them are multiples of 11.
Up next, is there something trying to help us figure out this code to humanity? And could they be using our own ancient sites on this planet?